looking at evidence here, and I think that if we look that concealed carry weapons permit holders have accounted for 0 crimes with firearms, 0 crimes with firearms in schools, 0 mass shootings. And yet we are tired of being targeted as law-abiding citizens. There are many of us here today, many people wearing yellow shirts, too many to all have yellow shirts. But I will assure you that we will all vote in November. Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions or comments for this witness? And thank you, sir, for your service. Sir, good evening and welcome.
Up means on. I can read the thing here. Sorry. Up means on. My name is Ray Antea. Not a public speaker, so you're going to have to bear with me. I am a combat veteran of Naval Special Warfare. I am a medic. I was a medic with the Sheriff's Department in Los Angeles from 1992 after I got blown up in the first Persian Gulf. I survived North Hollywood shootout. There were several other high round count incidents that we survived. Mr. Metz, your contention that going against an armed person with an assault rifle, whatever an assault rifle may be, with a handgun wouldn't work out well for the person with a handgun. You're absolutely wrong about that. Throwing cans at a person with an assault rifle, you're sitting duck, okay? I say if you don't listen to these little girls that we're over here talking about, worrying about their safety in the schools, and your solution is, well, don't put guns in schools. Harden the schools. We harden our banks. We harden our airports. We harden our jewelry stores. We harden our state house, okay? Justifiably so. People that may take over your positions are in school now. Why wouldn't we want to do something? The next president of the United States may be in school right now. Well, not now, I mean, obviously, because they're not 35, but I say we need to fortify the schools. Your assault weapons ban or so-called assault weapons ban to try and protect children is ludicrous. Assault weapons are out there. There's nothing that I couldn't get in your district alone. Drugs have been illegal since before I was born, and I'm 50 years old. I could walk out here right now, and I'm willing to bet you within 100 feet of the grounds of this place, I could find some drugs. I almost guarantee you within 200 feet of this place, I could buy an illegal firearm with a high capacity, whatever that is, magazine. If you think that, I forget who was saying it, you get 3 seconds, it takes 3 seconds to reload. I train police officers and first responders. I'm not the greatest competitor in the world when it comes to handgun competitions. This Saturday, my son and I were up at our range, and I tested myself, and I was 1.12 seconds in a mag change on my 1911. On my AR-15, I was 1.24. 1.24. You couldn't stop me from getting to you from here by foot in 1.24 seconds. Having restricted magazine counts does nothing. When I worked for the Sheriff's Department, we walked out with 45 rounds. We had 15 rounds in our sidearm and another 30 rounds on our mags. I knew numerous people that carried hundreds and hundreds of rounds in their patrol bags. We didn't have AR-15s before the North Hollywood shootout. We had the occasional MP5, which is a 9mm long gun, which is absolutely useless. It's like throwing this microphone at somebody. My department, where I worked, we had 1,935 sworn deputies that worked in just my division. There were 4 AR-15 qualified people. If something happened, you had to drive back to Station House, go to the armor, get your AR-15, and then respond. North Hollywood changed that. I say all of these school shootings should change how we handle security at our schools. I'm a concealed carry holder. I drive around and I see that I'm in a school zone. How many school zones are there? I live in Chepachet. I drive through at least 3 school zones on 44 just to get to 295. Are you gonna make me a felon because I'm just going about my day? If I take my children to school, am I supposed to leave my sidearm in a car? If I take one of my 3 kids to school or my granddaughter to school, am I going to leave my sidearm in a vehicle that, for For all honesty, when I picked up my Attorney General permit in 2002, when I moved back to the state of Rhode Island after retiring from the Sheriff's Department, as I was walking back to my Jeep, I confronted a guy who had stolen my stereo, who was stealing a stereo in the back of in the car right behind me. I gave foot pursuit to that person, called 911, had no idea where I had been because I had been to Rhode Island maybe 3 times in my entire life before that. I had just picked up my concealed carry permit at the Attorney General's office, and my stuff is being stolen. So if I'm going to leave my sidearm in my vehicle where I'm not going to be in custody and control of it, what sense does that make? There have been zero incidents of a concealed carry person having any issues in a school. We have had incidents, not so much in schools, but in churches, where people that have been armed have stopped the massacres that were about to happen. We've all seen it in Texas. Hate to say it, that guy was stopped by a guy with an evil black assault rifle. And he was an NRA member, much like myself. We need to harden our schools. We need to put some bite in our laws. I didn't even know this, but if I have my granddaughter with me and I'm out slinging drugs and I've got my SIG 1911 on my hip and I know the man's coming and I give my granddaughter my firearm, she's not going to get in trouble for that? Why wouldn't a juvenile who's doing adult crimes get adult time? If you come up with this assault weapons ban, and now I'm a felon for possession, or let's take you're carrying a gun on school property proposal. I carry a gun on school grounds, I'm a felon. So what? So what? What's going to happen? I'm going to go to court, and you're going to tell me, stop it, don't do that. What's the downside of me carrying a firearm? Because the judge is going to say, you need to not do that, bad boy. Right? These people don't fear what's going to happen to them. You get the kid who brought a firearm onto Providence Place property, discharged his firearm maliciously, and was out 3 days later? To do what? To do the same thing? The person who murdered my stepfather in Ocala, Florida, had just been released from prison. He discharged his firearm numerous times, stolen firearm, discharged it numerous times at other robberies, had been arrested before, was out on parole, on pending trial, and murdered my stepfather. Stepfather should have known better. My stepfather should have had his sidearm on him. That's all I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions or comments for this witness? Thank you. The next group of witnesses we have are Dorothy Carlson, Terry Givens, and Jill Gabrielson.
Ma'am, you may begin.
Thank you for staying. It's a long night for you all also. Well, I get to leave. A couple things have come up that I just want to address. Actually, I'm addressing the red flag and guns in schools. But carrying a long arm in public, I had no idea about that law, but I have a thought about it as you address it. I have friends who go to Bethel Synagogue, and they pointed out that in Charlotte, the white supremacist Nazis carried signs in front of the synagogue in Charlotte and walked up and down the sidewalk with long arms, assault weapon type long arms on their back. If that's not threatening, I don't know what is, and I don't understand why it's free speech that they could carry that long gun while marching up and down with symbols against them. It's something to think about as to why I've decided you You shouldn't carry long arms in public. It's a symbol of threat. My understanding is Scalia also said the Heller law ruling did not mean you could not regulate. I'll just point that out. I'm looking at the red flag law, and I see one of the problems is going to be the HIPAA laws. Because I truly believe, and this is something that is not, it's almost against everything I used to believe, that we need to take, due process is going to happen afterwards if the flags come up. And that also, somehow, and when we pass our background check, there has to be a way of saying you will waive your rights to a HIPAA search on mental health. And I don't know how you're going to do it. But this came up with my husband this morning, that there's got to be some way to make sure you can get that mental health background check.
Let me stop
And-
you for 1 second. I think you're right on top of exactly what needs to happen, and that when I do a lot of personal injury, some of the other people up here do as well, some of the other attorneys, and when you sign a HIPAA form and you send it in, you're opening yourself up to disclosure of medical records. So I don't have the answer. It's not fully worked out. But when you do agree to a background check, someone who's law-abiding and some of the people in this room who are lawfully carrying guns and have lawful permits, they're not the ones who will have the concern of opening themselves up to a HIPAA check. I wouldn't have a concern. It's the people that have something necessarily to hide. So you have to look at within the scope of a HIPAA inquiry, tying it down so it's not too broad. So you wouldn't want it to be overly broad, and it needs to be worked out.
I have no idea how
on-
you're going to do it.
I think you're on top of what needs to be done, but go ahead.
Because the Parkland shooter had got his guns legally, which scared me. I think the reason the red flag, if you want to look at it, those guns have to be removed immediately when those flags come up. We've developed, whether people like it or not, we have developed guns that are easy to kill many people. When my dad went hunting, and I grew up in a hunting family, I didn't because I just can't. His attitude, and he was a career naval officer, was when you go hunting, you should be able to shoot the deer with one bullet. If you can't, you better shoot it with a second one, or quite honestly, you have no business carrying that gun. And he wanted a double action shotgun. He also didn't, and this is going to go against everybody, didn't feel civilians should have military-grade weapons. That's an issue that's going to infuriate people, but that's how he felt, and he was a career officer, and he worked in security. My whole thing with the red flag is I want you to find a way to remove those guns and then do due process, figure out how long the due process, you wait to get the due process, but the guns have got to go first. I agree with Senator Metz on guns in schools. In the Warren Town Council last year, when they were discussing not having guns in school, a permit carrier, an older gentleman, stood up and said he'd worked very hard to get this permit. He studied hard for tests, and he wanted to be able to carry a gun to his school. But following him, a gentleman who had been in special ops and had just retired. And as he said, he trained under fire. He trained, like Senator Metz was saying, and he said it's a whole different kind of training when you're under fire than when you're not. And he said, look, here's my hunting license, here's my fishing license, here's my concealed carry. I have 2 daughters. They're in the schools. I do not want people carrying a concealed weapon except for trained personnel. And he felt very strongly about that, and yet he had been a gun carrier. He had worked with guns. He knew how to work with them. So that is, plus I happen to believe that magazines got to be limited to 10. And Gabby Giffords, that shooting was stopped when the guy went to reload to another magazine. A woman with no gun jumped on his back, and then some men came and held him down. But it was that split second when he had to stop what he was doing and focus differently that they were able to stop him. So that's something to think about. And I think really everyone said everything I was going to say.
Not a question. Mr. Chairman, Officer, I just want to, I spoke with the chair. The intent of the chair, so that we're clear, is when folks testify, they leave the room so that we can fill the chairs. So if anybody's already testified, if they could kindly leave the room so that we can then fill the chairs, so that we can try and get out by a reasonable hour. How's that sound?
Thank you, Senator.
Do I want to leave now or wait?
No, you can wait, ma'am. Ma'am, you can proceed.
Up is on.
Can you hear me? Oh, now I can hear myself. Okay, my name is Terry Givens. I'm from Warwick, Rhode Island, and my son is 27 years old right now, but if anything ever happened to him, if he was shot, I wouldn't want to live anymore. And so I certainly feel for moms who have children, and what happened at that school in Florida is hideous. This really is a major problem, and it needs to take priority because there needs to be some kind of compromise between those that own guns and those that don't own guns. And there needs to be a connection actually between both groups, because it's only going to be solved between all of us. First of all, one of the problems, it's definitely mental illness. The fact that Rhode Island has a law against intel, keeping intel about people in schools, people that have problems, that we can't be notified by the FBI. There's a problem in connection, finding information about, passing information on about criminals or people with mental problems, because they shouldn't be having guns to begin with, obviously. And so that is definitely an issue. But it seems to me like we have a problem in Providence around the mall, and that's Providence. And it seems to me that's where most of the murders have been committed in a number of years. So that's actually a major city problem. And that has something to do with opiates, and it also has something to do with gangs. Now, all these people behind me in the yellow shirts, I've talked to a few people, and they've given me a lot of information. One of the things we really need to know about is guns. I know very little about guns. I took a course once at the Cranston Community Police Station, which is out on Phoenix Avenue, and in the course, I was able to shoot a gun. Well, I was a very bad shot because you could take 6 shots, and you were supposed to hit the poster in the heart. And with 3 shots, I hit him in the brain 3 times. And after that, I didn't want to shoot the gun anymore. That was enough. The idea was horrible to me. But I wanted to know what it was like. I want to be educated about things. And money. Definitely, we need to have protections in the schools, not guns. But one of the things I saw on Facebook was in the South, where they had figured out there's actually a compartment that can be built, and it's bulletproof. And so, of course, that would be a sizable, well, not necessarily, but that's better than having guns at the school, finding someplace very quickly where small groups of kids could go. And then, of course, there is You could have a guard at the school, at the doors. You can also have metal detectors, not guns. Not everyone needs to carry a gun. Human nature is emotional, stupid sometimes, and youth are not extremely knowledgeable. You give them a gun, and without the parents around, especially people, well, you certainly, my parents never gave me a gun. I never saw a gun except the rifle that my father came back with from World War II. And it was a wood with a piece of metal on the end of it. But there are better decisions than putting guns in schools. Now, as I see it, I've spoken to some of these people behind me, and they're very nice, some of them. Others, I think, are crazy because you just, you know, this man that just spoke, I'm sorry, but he's definitely, you can tell that he was a sheriff, you know, because he really believes in having, you know, guns around a lot. But these people mostly seem to be hunters, or they doing it as a sport. These are not the people that are our problem. The people that are our problem are the gangs and.
Excuse me, ma'am. Senator Metz.
Yeah, we just have to remind you that
Yes.
we appreciate your testimony, but we don't refer to other people that are testifying. If I'm correct, Mr. Vice Chair?
Yes, Senator. We don't personalize it. So you moved away from him quick enough. Had you stayed on him, I would have
okay.
admonished you. Thank
Well-
you, Senator Metz.
Okay, I'm sorry. I appreciated getting an education about guns, and actually, it's people that I spoke to here that gave me more information than I've ever had. And I think in order for you to make decisions about which guns are the worst, because our country started on tolerance. People came in, and we tolerated different people. It wasn't easy, but eventually, America was built on tolerating differences, you know, and we learned to get along. But now there's certain things that should not be tolerated, and these heavy-duty weapons are definitely that. I don't want guns taken away from anybody if it's for hunting or target shooting, that type of thing. Across America for years, people have had their guns in different areas. Now, I never had that, but I never thought anything was wrong with it. I actually met a few people along the way in my lifetime that did have guns and went out hunting for meat. You know, that was their thing. And so I have no objection to that. But everybody has to give. We definitely need protection in the schools. Find it, get it, think about it, prioritize, do it now with all these kids in Florida so upset and it's being all over the news. Get the money, get Trump to give some of it up. You know, get the money from the state, not for a ballpark, not for tolls, or take the money from the tolls and put it into protecting schools, protecting the kids in schools by different suggestions that have been given here today. And that's pretty much all I have to say, and thank you for, I'm so glad to see that so many of you have stayed to listen, and so thank you very much.
Thank you, ma'am. Senator Lombardi.
Thank you. Those of you that know me know that I've never met a microphone that I didn't like, but I've been conspicuously silent tonight because I made a pledge tonight to be a listener to what everybody has to say, both sides. But you said something that was you said a couple of things that were very poignant to me that I feel compelled, and I made the pledge to the chairwoman. She's not in the room, so I can break my pledge and talk. So, but first and foremost, you mentioned that you have a 27-year-old. When I have 27-year-old twins and who work in a major city, in a major mecca of entertainment, above a major train station. There's not a day goes by that I don't worry for them. And that's the God's honest truth. But that being said, it's the world that we live in, regrettably. And but you also said something else. And the Journal, unfortunately, covered one half, the House half of the committee that I served on, because I served on the commission, the Joint Commission on Guns and Behavioral Medicine. And I can tell you that 101% of this area, that is guns and violence, is about mental health. And it's the bottom line. It's mental health. We can argue, and symbolically, it bothers me. The third thing that you said is that we've got to reach a resolution, and you're right. And there's valuable competing interests here. And in fact, I think that the yellow and the red is really symbolic of how far apart we are.
Yeah.
And how we should come to the middle.
Right.
Just in this room and the makeup of this room.
Mine's orange.
And orange too, right, yeah, that's right, that's what how you make it, right. But my point is, this is the most difficult evening of the night for the Senate Judiciary Committee, by far. I happen to be someone, and I've said it before, I'll say it again, that I'd much rather have someone with a concealed carry weapon on them in a school ground if, God forbid, some psychopath should come onto the school ground. I also take issue with what Mayor Elorza had to say, that he somehow predicted someday this is going to happen in Rhode Island. I really, really am troubled by those words.
Right.
Because God forbid it should ever happen in Rhode Island.
Right.
We can make a point, but we can't make a point that specifically, and I really take issue with that. So I hope, and I think that the poster child for all of this, and you're not going to hear another word from me the rest of the night, but I hope that the poster child for all of this was last year's compromise. We all agreed in the room that someone who's convicted of domestic abuse ought not have a gun.
Right.
And there are certain people, and I think the folks in yellow and the folks in red would agree, that there are certain people in this world that should not have a gun.
Right.
But there are people who should have guns.
Yeah.
And you use the word, or the phrase, law-abiding citizens. And they are law-abiding citizens. Our Supreme Court, as Senator Jabor has pointed out, has recognized that their Second Amendment right is an individual right. It's a Bill of Rights, but it applies to us individually through the states, through the Due Process Clause. And so it's an important right. It's not something to be taken lightly. And the last thing I'm going to say is that I fear that sometimes bad facts make bad law. I've said that before. I've said that 1,000 times. And the poster child for that is the station fire. We had a horrific set of circumstances occur where 100 people died in a fire. And the result was reactionary. And the reaction was to create a fire code that shut down 1,000 businesses in the state of Rhode Island. I exaggerate, but that's the case. I look at the Florida case, and I would never be here able to speak if, God forbid, that was my child or my grandchild. God forbid. There's nobody in this room, yellow, red, blue, white, whatever color shirt we're wearing, would have anything but sympathy for those poor victims in Florida and Sandy Hook and all the others. But the fact of the matter, I keep thinking in my head, what would have prevented that? I'm not so sure anything would have prevented that. If the FBI of the United States had intel on this kid and they couldn't stop him, who in the hell's going to stop him? Excuse my vernacular. I want you to know, and I want everybody to know here, and I'll just stay my peace. We're listening very hard to both sides of this issue. We empathize with everyone's position in this case. But you triggered something in me for the reasons of, one, mental health, two, 27-year-olds. Had to be 27. Couldn't have been 28 or 26. I would have shut my mouth. And you know, mental illness, and obviously resolution. I think we can come together. You know, there are certain things that we can agree on that are obvious. There are others that are not so obvious. And I hope and I pray that that happens. But God forbid, I don't want this ever to happen in Rhode Island.
Right, that's
Thank
it.
you.
We've been lucky so far, and I'm sorry, I don't mean to insult any of you. No, we all have common ground to find, solutions. I'm not
Ma'am, thank you. We really
Thank
need to
you.
move on. We appreciate
Okay.
your humility. Thank you. Any other questions or concerns? No. Ma'am, you may proceed. Thank you, and thank you, Senator.
First of all, I wanted to apologize. It was my cell phone. I apologize that went off. Let's just say I'm technologically challenged. But I'm coming to testify today as a pediatrician and a mother and someone who has served in the Air Force for 6 years. As a pediatrician, I'm in a proud tradition of doctors who really pay attention to public health by things like making sure that people have clean water, lead-free paint, vaccines. All of these things are public health measures. We don't just pay attention to the child who is in front of us, but try to pay attention to the health and safety of children all over the country. And unfortunately, we are falling down on our jobs because of all wealthy countries, more children die, a greater percentage of children die in the US than any other wealthy country. In fact, our rate is twice the rate of Spain or Italy or Sweden. And so I feel like we really need to address this issue, and I think at least let's try to agree on a red flag bill. I don't want to take away guns from any law-abiding citizens. I do think that hopefully we can all agree that that guns should not be in the hands of a homicidal person or in the hands of a suicidal person. I lived in Maine for about 15 years in a very rural area that had about 20,000 people. In 15 years that I was there, 4 people committed suicide with guns. That was a pretty high rate, and they all had children and grandchildren that I knew. So this is a public health issue, and if we can't do anything else, let's at least pass the red flag bill. Thank you.
Thank you, Doctor. Is there anyone else who has questions for the doctor? Thank you very much. Call our next witnesses. Tara Abuyan, Robert Hall, Michael Creamer. There are 2 of you. If you,
We'll start with you, ma'am. Good evening and welcome.
Good evening. Can you hear me okay? Yep. Thank you.
Buttons up, you're all set.
Yes. My name is Tara Aboyan. I live in Portsmouth, Rhode Island. And I want to start out with a personal experience that I feel directly supports the Extreme Risk Protection Order, the Red Flag Act. 1998, age of 20, my friend from high school. Brilliant student. He skipped the senior year of high school, went on to college, went over to Scotland to study genetic engineering, and he flipped. And I knew this. I knew that he wasn't in his right mind. I made a ton of phone calls to every helpline that I could. I notified his parents. My parents notified his parents. At the extreme point, he came over to my parents' house and handed my parents $1,000 for my brother. And my parents immediately called his parents, and they called local police. Local police then said that they were going to contact all the other local police in the state. I don't know if they did or not, and the state police. and the campus police at the university that I was attending at the time. So as I knew what was going on, I was trying to continue my studies in engineering. And so half the time I was studying and warning the other people in my department not to tell them who I was, or not to tell anybody who was looking for me, I should say, who my current friends were or anything like that. He was trying to hunt me to find my current boyfriend. And so I would hide inside rooms so that I wasn't in the visibility of the doors, so that I wouldn't endanger other people in there while I was continuing to try to study. When I completed my work, I would get in my car and try to go on the roads and find him so that I could actually smash my car into his car to stop him. I had no other way to stop him. I had tried everything I could with the current laws, and his parents had tried. He went to another state, purchased a gun, a rifle, and went to the house that I was renting. I have no idea how he found that out. Luckily, no one was home. His father was able to track him down there. His father jumped on the car, tried to actually stop him, but the windows were rolled up. They drove around Narragansett. My friend was trying to shake him off the car. They made it all the way over to the beach. And while his father was still banging on the windows trying to get in, he shot himself. There was ample notice given to law enforcement throughout the state, campus police. What we found out later was the campus police, or security, whatever you want to refer to them as, had actually detained them. And this part was in a court proceeding. The local police had assured the parents that if they found him, that he would be detained and his keys would be taken from him in order to get opportunity to pick him up and get him to treatment. The police also spoke with the university campus security directly, and they said that they would detain him if he was located. The local university's testimony said that they would conduct a well-being check if found and try to keep him there until the father got there. But 37 hours after they initially contacted the police in their own town, 2 campus security did stop him, and they said they were doing a welfare check directly to him and asked him to please get in touch with his parents. It was about a 5-minute conversation. The officer said that nothing in his demeanor concerned them or indicated danger to himself. The officer also said that they were not told to detain him. So there were also affidavits from 2 professionals. Although may have appeared stable, I'm not inserting his name, to the security, a fact which was presently disputed, potentially suicidal individuals do have the capability of masking their intent and their unstable emotions for a short period of time. So one of the reasons I'm giving this is I'm imploring you to work out with psychologists what a reasonable amount of time to detain them and investigate the situation, because they are able to mask for a short period of time, as evidenced here. So his risk, again, this is continued from that affidavit, his risk of committing suicide if he was not detained and provided treatment was reasonably foreseeable to a reasonable degree of medical certainty. There was, at the time, Rhode Island General Law 40.1-5-7 could have enforced the idea of maintaining him or keeping him in their custody, but it was not done. So yes, extreme risk protection order and fix NICS, those 2 things I am in strong support of. But I also want to impress upon you as legislators that 2 changes like that aren't going to solve this whole thing. My background is chemical engineering, and I do understand the comment that was made about breaking the accident chain. You'll see in what I handed to you, there is reference to LOPA, which is layer of protection analysis. So for a chemical facility, when you're doing analysis of a chemical facility, you actually want to look at the layers of protection. You don't assume that when you put one layer on there that it's safe. I also worked as a consultant for DHS under CFATS, which is Chemical Facility Anti-Terrorism Act. So I actually went around the country going to different chemical facilities and looking at their vulnerabilities and the different types of adversaries that would attack and trying to assist them in finding out how to deal with that. So doing security vulnerability analysis for a school when you are considering hardening the school, I don't put hardening as the top of my list, but through LOPA analysis, you will see that you need to consider many layers of protection. Having one or two or even three, there will be holes, there will be failures. And if you imagine, this sounds like a very goofy thing to imagine, but the CCPS, even the Center for Chemical Process Safety, even pushes this strongly with large chemical facilities. Imagine a block of Swiss cheese, and your layers of protection are the layers of the Swiss cheese. If all of your holes line up, then your incident will occur. If you have enough layers, it reduces the risk and the potential for the accident in their case or incident in our case to actually occur. So as you will see, I'm not going to go through all of these here, but I have a number of different items that I'm interested in you evaluating. But for the most part, licensed, registered, and trained properly. And something else that I find potentially a solution to add to that LOPA or layers of protection is to put a psychiatric evaluation on those who want to obtain high or rapid fire devices or high capacity magazines. I'm not necessarily saying that these have to be gone. I don't personally like them. And I do understand that some are thinking beyond hunting and beyond sporting events for personal protection, and you have to often fight like with like. However, to ensure that those who have it, who have obtained it, to have safe storage and a psych eval, I think is a good compromise. Okay. I also pointed out different potential funding sources for these items that I listed in here. And I'm hoping that this information could be passed along to our legislators at the federal level as well, because I don't think that this will be fixed just within the state, especially with NICS. And if we don't solve it at a federal level, then it's not hard for somebody, such as my friend, to travel within 37 hours back and forth to another state and do what he wants to do. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any questions or comments for this witness? Thank you. Sir, good evening and welcome.
Hello, my name is Robert Hall. I do not speak for the NRA. I believe I speak for at least some people who are wearing yellow shirts out there because I compete with them. And I heard testimony of several things tonight, which was a little bit disturbing based on one central fact. The Rhode Island Constitution contains within its body a very simple statement. The right to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. That statement was written, obviously, centuries ago, based on the Rhode Island Charter that was given by the Crown. But the concept was that the average person, the typical person, is the person that you're not supposed to be afraid of. They are the person that is the foundation of your society. Of a couple of thousand people that were in those halls tonight, 99% of them are not people that you need to fear. If you asked virtually any of those people, what law would they back? They'll tell you in a minute. They'll back any law that focuses on the criminal. Now, of the things that I've heard tonight, one that was especially of concern to me was from one of the distinguished police officers that testified, concerned the red flag law. I understand the concept of that. If it passes judicial review and gets enacted, I imagine it will become law. But there was one inference there that concerned me. Well, how would I know, how could I find out if this guy had guns? Well, what we're talking about there is gun registration. That's how you would find out directly. Gun registration is specifically something that the NRA and the average gun owner would fight to the death to prevent, for the simple reason that it creates a succinct list which can be used for confiscation. This is well known. It's been done. It was done in Germany. It was done in Russia. It was done in China. It can be done by any government that chooses to do so. And our constitutions are designed to restrict government. It's not they tell us what we can do. We tell them what their authority is. And it's been pretty clear, both at the state level and the Rhode Island Constitution was used in the Heller case as evidence to back up the decision that the right to keep and bear arms is an individual right. Now, I can't speak for every firearm, but I can speak, I think, intelligibly on this magazine ban or magazine size issue. I am qualified with basically every firearm that has been used by the U.S. military since the late Civil War period through the present. As part of my competition, I'm expected to be able to deliver 10 rounds with a reloading of a rifle within 70 seconds. I could do that at 300 yards and a target about that big. Now, I can do that with an AR-15. I could do it with a bolt-action rifle. And while I couldn't guarantee the accuracy, I could probably do it with a single-shot falling block rifle. You are not going to gain safety by reducing magazine capacity. British soldiers in World War II were able to fire their bolt-action Lee Enfield rifles roughly as fast as we could fire our M1 Garand rifle, which was semi-automatic. So there is no gain other than psychological. If you give me two 10-round magazines, I will fire absolutely as fast as someone with a 20-round magazine. But the difference is if I am trained, I will do so very, very decisively. Now, there is the question about the AR-15 being some monstrously destructive assault rifle designed only for killing people. That little .223 caliber bullet that is used in the AR-15 is what used to be called a varmint cartridge, used for woodchucks, prairie dogs, and other small creatures. It does not generally do the damage to a human being that quite a few other choices do, and it gives a false sense of security. Now, sure, you could probably get by a law that could ban the AR-15. Maybe somebody could even do it nationally. And if you didn't produce a civil war as a result, what you would have done is eliminated the 99% of those rifles that are never going to be used to commit a crime. You would have either made felons of or penalized 99% of your population that own them. You would have taken billions of dollars in personal property, literally taken it, or made it impossible to sell legally if it were done on a national level. And what you would have gained is precisely nothing, because the 1% that is used in crime will never be surrendered. And for those wishing to make one, an AR-15 can be legally manufactured in your cellar with something as little as your router and a kit that you can buy that allows you to create the only part of it that is federally regulated. Okay? Now, this is by law. This exists already. They're called ghost guns, and as a matter of fact, they can be made on a great many firearms. You want to pass a law like that federally? Maybe that would help. But as it stands now, you want legally not protecting yourselves against anyone choosing to acquire a firearm for illegal use. Okay? You're not protecting yourself with the magazines. You're not protecting yourself with a gun design. I've heard so many people focus on the AR-15. There's got to be half a dozen or more firearms that do exactly the same thing or worse that you don't even know about. Okay? So if you want to protect children, by all means, protect them. Now, as a former teacher, I'm not advocating teachers running around with firearms on their hip, but a simple expedient called a biometric safe, a little box about like this that can be secured in a classroom, would allow a teacher who was suitably screened and licensed to carry to put a firearm in that safe, which is inaccessible to students. And if that awful last resort exists, where some wild man comes in the door of that classroom, that's what that gun is for, to protect the students in the worst case, last resort scenario. Should schools have armed security guards? I believe they should. Well-trained people, well-screened people. Now, there was a question raised about mental evaluation, psychological evaluation. That presumes, basically, that everybody that wants to buy a gun is somehow unbalanced enough to be a risk. I would offer you up a ridiculous retort to that. There are many people that say, well, liberalism is a mental disorder. It makes about as much sense as applying that to the people that are going to legally try to buy a firearm. Can you tighten up the mandatory purchase, mandatory checks? I hope so. I talked to a lovely lady who testified here who was concerned about gun shows. Well, gun shows are crawling with people with federal firearms licenses. In most cases, you couldn't get out the door with a gun unless you went through an FFL, the waiting period, the background check, and all that, and then received it from a federally firearm licensed person. So many of these things that people are pursuing as solutions are already covered under the law. In Florida, we witnessed a horrible combination, not only of police not acting locally, but a coalition between the police department and the school districts, which did not report criminality because it made things look better on the school records. As a result, no background check would reveal any problem with that deranged individual and perhaps a number of others. So the local police failed, the school department failed, the FBI failed, in part because nobody had the complete information. Now, you want to attack that. That's a real good thing to attack. Tighten up the whole concept of communication. If you can do it, and I hope you can, get HIPAA records released. I don't know if you can do that. I think the ACLU will be all over you. But if you can do it, it's fine with me. Okay? If you want to ban bump stocks, I fired a bump stock. It's a piece of junk. It's a toy. If you want to ban some kind of crank trigger that fires a semi-automatic rifle very rapidly, go ahead, ban it. But don't include in that rule, well, we can also decide anything else we want that might be worth banning. That's the difference. I think most of those people out there who've tried the bump stock and who realize how ridiculous it is would sign off, let you do it. Go ahead, get rid of it. But a clean bill, not something that has some little surprises built into it that could come back and haunt all of us later on. Okay? That's really all I have to say. But just please be aware that our Constitution is designed to protect us from government, and people in government have the responsibility to exercise that protection. If you're going to penalize and essentially create felons of 99% of the gun owners, so that the 1% that are actually felons get loose, you haven't gained anything.
Thank you. Any questions or comments for this witness? Thank you. Sir, good evening and welcome.
Thank you. Madam Chairperson, Senators, my name is Michael Kramer. I know I'm maybe dressed like a paid lobbyist, but I'm not. I'm a retired lawyer, a concerned citizen, a Rhode Island voter, and a volunteer for the Rhode Island Coalition Against Gun Violence. I'm also an honorably discharged officer in the United States Army, which is where I learned to disassemble, assemble, and fire the M16, and of course qualified with that weapon. And I'm familiar with that weapon. The AR-15, which has been referred to earlier, is the same weapon. The only difference from the one that I used in the service is that I could shoot it on burst or on automatic, where the AR-15 cannot. But actually, the United States Army, since the 1980s, has trained its soldiers to fire on semi-automatic. And in fact, conventional soldiers were only given a semi-automatic version of this weapon because semi-automatic, the AR-15 or the M16, is more accurate and more deadly. I'm here in support, obviously, of the Bill 2493, the assault weapons ban. The argument that I've heard from this table is that we don't know what an assault weapon is. Well, that's a red herring. We do know what an assault weapon is. The 1994 Federal Act defined it. The bill that you have before you specifically defines what an assault weapon is. An assault weapon is not an ordinary pistol or an ordinary shotgun or an ordinary rifle. The bill was designed and written to specify exactly what is an assault weapon. And it gives examples of what is included as an assault weapon, including the AR-15, which is the most popular weapon, which was banned in 1994. And
Senator Archambault.
I'm just going to jump in for 1 second. I've read the bill, and I've looked at the plethora of guns that are included in the assault weapon definition. And I'm an attorney by trade, and I'm not exactly unskilled at reading detailed papers or bills. And I'm not clear on what an assault weapon is. So you can see it crystal clearly from this bill. And
I read the bill, and I understand what the bill is.
God bless you, because some of my colleagues I've talked to, and myself included, and many of them actually, are unclear on what it says. But you can go ahead in your testimony.
Senator, if you think a more specific definition is required, I certainly wouldn't object. I'm not a draftsman of bills.
Yeah, I just continue with your testimony. I'm saying it objectively. I just really, from looking at the bill, I'm not clear on what it is. There's a lot of guns that are included in that, and so it becomes a little confusing as to how you clearly define. I know you referenced the Federal Act, but I just want to throw that out there that some of us, even reading this stuff regularly, grapple with how you define it. But you go ahead.
Well, the most popular assault weapon, if you will, is the AR-15. Assault weapons like that are of no value to hunters. Your deer or your prey would be worthless to you if you shot it. The only hunting you can really do with a weapon like that is hunting people. And this is a weapon that's excellent for that purpose. One of the speakers said that the amount of damage can be done by this weapon is overstated. Today's New York Times has an article, which I commend to you, about the damage done to people who've been shot with the AR-15. The article talks about it specifically, and there are interviews with maybe a dozen doctors, some of whom were in the military, some of whom have treated victims of mass shootings, describing the actual damage done to a human being when shot with a weapon like the AR-15. The AR-15 and weapons like it are designed to kill as many people as possible, as efficiently as possible, and they're very good at it. The shooter in Aurora, who killed 15 people, did it with an AR-15. The shooter in Newtown, who killed 27 people, did it with an AR-15. The San Bernardino killer killed 14 people with an AR-15. The Las Vegas shooter killed 58 people with an AR-15. In Sutherland Springs, Texas, 26 people were killed by a killer with that weapon. And of course, last month in Parkland, 17 people died victims of someone shooting an AR-15, and the weapon was doing what it was designed to do, which is to be deadly to people. Now, after each and every one of these mass shootings, elected officials like yourselves expressed and offered their thoughts and prayers to the victims and to the victims' families. But in Connecticut, after the Newtown shooting, the state legislature did more than offer thoughts and prayers. The state legislature did something concrete. They banned assault weapons in Connecticut, joining New York, Massachusetts, and other states. It's time for our General Assembly to do the same thing before something happens here. If you saw the Providence Journal this morning, it was reported that a neutral poll indicated that 60% of Rhode Islanders favor an assault weapons ban. That's your constituents. If we fail to enact this ban, and I mean the Senate and those of us whom you represent, then we will be complicit if this happens again. Now, one question that people have raised is, what about the Second Amendment? How does this comport with the Second Amendment? And Senator Jabbar correctly pointed out that the Heller decision of the Supreme Court was the first decision which talked about individual rights to own guns. I commend you to read Heller. The Heller decision held that individuals have the right to have a pistol at home for self-protection. That's the extent of the Heller holding. And in that holding, Justice Scalia, no friend of gun control, wrote, again, as the senator indicated, like most rights, the right secured by the Second Amendment is not unlimited. The right is not a right to keep and carry any weapon whatsoever in any manner whatsoever and for whatever purpose. And then Justice Scalia, writing for the majority, went on to detail a number of restrictions which are obviously permissible under the Second Amendment, keeping firearms away from felons, from the mentally ill. And contrary to what one of the lobbyists for the indicated, Justice Scalia made it clear that under the Second Amendment, the use and carrying of guns in schools could be banned, contrary to what was said earlier. We believe, I believe, and I think Rhode Islanders believe, that it's time to act. The Second Amendment is no bar to reasonable restrictions on the ownership of guns. Now, I've also heard that the 1994 automatic weapons ban assault weapons ban didn't stop crime. Well, most crimes aren't committed with an assault weapon. This isn't a crime bill. This isn't a bill designed to reduce crime where I live or where you live. It's a bill that's designed to make it harder for ordinary citizens to own weapons which can be used to kill many people at a time. If Florida had had this law in effect, then Nicholas Cruz, who bought the assault weapon that killed 17 people in Parkland, couldn't have bought his weapon. Could he have hurt people in other ways, with a handgun or with a knife? Sure, he could have, but he couldn't have killed 17 people as quickly as he did. Now, what about assault weapons that are already in private hands? This bill does not take those away. This bill grandfathers people in Rhode Island who currently lawfully own assault weapons. Now, in a perfect world, I can imagine that those would have to be turned in, which is what was done successfully in Australia. But in a perfect world, that would be the case. But this is not a perfect world, and I think we're all well aware that a bill which required turning in existing assault weapons would not have much of a chance of passage in the House or in the Senate. We shouldn't let the perfect, which is the elimination of all assault weapons, stand in the way or be the enemy of the good, which is to prevent more assault weapons from proliferating in our state. The 1994 assault weapon ban did its job. The number of assault weapons that were sold during that period of time went down dramatically. And in 2004, when the assault weapons ban expired, sales increased greatly. The goal of this bill is not to stop crime. The goal of this bill is to make it harder for individuals to obtain weapons which are military weapons intended to kill people. No one needs an assault weapon at home for home protection. If I have a handgun or a rifle or a shotgun, I'm adequately protected if someone tries to break into my home if I'm afraid of that. Now, I suppose if the 82nd Airborne came at my house, that might be a different story, but that's not a likely scenario. You know, I'd like to quote Edward Stack, who puts this issue in a fairly simple and important way. Mr. Stack, I didn't know this, but Mr. Stack is the CEO of Dick's Sporting Goods. And Mr. Stack was explaining why his company, under his leadership, was no longer going to sell assault weapons. And he made a profit, just like the gun manufacturers do in manufacturing it. Dick's Sporting Goods sold these weapons en masse. What he said was, we don't want to be part of a mass shooting. I don't think I want to be part of a mass shooting. I don't think people in Rhode Island do. And if we can stop the proliferation of these weapons, we will make some progress in doing that. I urge this committee to authorize this bill to come to the Senate floor for a vote. Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Jabour. I'm sorry, sir.
Or would you consider a question from the floor that is pertinent to what is
No,
presented?
no, sir. Unfortunately, this isn't, there are still hundreds of people here that are going
I-
to testify, but if there's something you'd like to submit by email or otherwise, you can feel free to do so.
It's just that-
Thank you. Sir, we gave you a chance, so other people who I'm sure didn't agree with you sat quietly. So Senator Jabour.
Yeah, thank you. Mr. Kramer, thank you for your testimony. It's obviously you're familiar with the Heller case. So the one thing that I think that Judge Scalia might say about the Rhode Island legislation to try to pass any constitutional challenge to it would be, I think what we're trying to do here is to prevent access to guns, if I could use the term. We're trying to prevent access to guns in the wrong, putting them in the wrong hands of individuals who are not rational, capable, and to handle that gun as required by law. We've heard a lot of testimony this evening from individuals who appear to be very rational, responsible, and prudent owners of weapons. And so I think the legislation here is not designed to prevent them from owning the guns that are legal. But I think you and I agree on one thing, that the gun that we're talking about, and you described it to the T, there's a common element there. For each and every situation that has happened in America that has involved mass shooting, you correctly identified what was the weapon of choice. And it was a weapon of choice for a reason. It was because someone with a very distorted mind, with evil intentions, decided, what could I get my hands on that could do the most damage? It was almost like when you watch one of these Schwarzenegger movies and you see him strap on what might be the most powerful weapon. And that's what happened in all of these cases. It's not as extreme as that, but look for the gun that can do the most damage. So think about the parents that had to look at those children that were destroyed just like an animal would have been destroyed when hit by that type of a gun. The lasting impression of that. So I think it is incumbent on the members of this body, and I'm hoping that we as a whole body, not just the Senate, but when the bills pass one chamber, that when they go to the next chamber, that chamber recognizes the importance of the legislation and we act in a very cooperative manner. That has not always been the way things are done here. But on this issue, I think the public has a demand that both chambers have to act. But your insight is, I would take that to the floor when the bill and cite many of your comments, because I think members of the Senate who don't understand the law. You've done a great job of describing it. Thank you.
Thank you. The next group of witnesses we have are Gabe Murnoff, Gail Harvey, and Philip West. Gabe, we'll start with you. I assume you have to go to school in the morning, so.
Well, we have late start tomorrow, 9:25. It's great.
Had I known, I would have made you wait, but
Oh, well,
now I'll let you go
scratch that then,
anyway.
scratch that, yeah.
Good evening and welcome.
Hi, my name is Gabe Murnoff. I'm a senior at Classical High School in Providence, and I'm here with the Rhode Island Coalition Against Gun Violence. And I'm here to talk about the assault weapons ban. But first, I'd like to thank the Judiciary Committee for allowing me to speak here today on this really important issue. Students really do need to be heard on matters of gun violence because obviously, as we've seen from Sandy Hook to Parkland, this issue does really affect us personally, perhaps more than any other societal issue. The proposed ban on assault weapons is easily one of the quickest and easiest ways to begin going about solving gun violence problems in the United States. It's well documented that the United States experiences significantly more mass shootings and overall homicides than the rest of the industrialized world combined, as has been made very clear tonight. And the explanation for why isn't complex. Time after time, future mass shooters are able to capitalize on some of the world's loosest gun laws to purchase military-style automatic weapons in order to bring terror to innocent civilians, often children and teachers. We need to take action because students like me all across the country are wondering if they're next. Why should I and so many other students be practically the only ones in the industrialized world that have to constantly fear being the next victims of gun violence when there's so many relatively easy and proven remedies right at our fingertips? And I think this is a good time to point out that there's been a lot of talk tonight, and if you talk to students, I think it's very important to see what students are saying on this. We do not want guns in schools. We do not want teachers with guns. There are some, this is a separate issue, of course, with teachers, but there are some teachers that I can tell you, even at Classical High School, which is supposed to be the best school in the state or whatever, there are a lot. Okay, it is the best school in the state. Yeah, okay, well, it's subjective, which is fine. Oh, okay. Well, it is. Okay, fine, it is.
We're in the ancient history book, though.
Yeah, right. But there are certainly some teachers that I would not want going to school with guns, although this is a separate issue. But we have to realize what students are saying on this, and I think it's extremely important. And a lot of the people here today are on both sides are certainly on the older side, and I think it's important for everybody to see what the young people are saying. What the young people are saying is that we're scared. More guns is not the solution, whether we're talking about automatic rifles or whether we're talking about handguns. Instead of getting bulletproof glass and taking other steps to turn our schools into military fortresses, we need to address the problem at its source and at the root. As has been alluded to an extent, including by the mayor, from 1994-2004, when assault weapons were banned in the United States, both the number of and the death count from mass shootings were way down. Compared to the decade before, 84 to 94, the number of mass shootings was decreased in comparison by 33%. Compared to the decade after, they were down 200% from 04 to 14, or compared to 2004-2014. And overall, countries and U.S. states that have stricter gun laws have significantly lower rates of deaths resulting from gun violence. So this is like, everybody's talking about evidence. There's a whole lot of evidence to say that if you have stricter gun laws with the assault weapons ban, then you will have lower rates of gun violence. And it's not a very hard causation to prove. The issues surrounding gun violence are very complex, but there are many areas where we can easily make a difference in making civilians and especially students feel safer in their learning environments. Student activism across the country in response to the Parkland shooting is sending a very clear message. Now more than ever, it's very important for politicians and all leaders to look after the needs and the interests of their constituents, especially the most vulnerable students, who often are not paid attention to because, of course, they can't vote, and when they do turn 18, they often don't vote, and unfortunately that's the case. When people don't vote, they don't get as much attention. And the last thing I want to address is that with the assault weapons ban, a lot of people are saying, like I heard Senator Marco Rubio say this on the national stage, that it's very hard to define it, and some people have alluded to this here tonight. Yes, it is very hard to define, and this is a very complicated issue, but does that mean we just give up? We just say, okay, we're just not going to do anything. AR-15s are continuously used in these mass shootings. They're continuously the weapon of choice. So let's just give up and call it a day, and let's not even try. It's going to be very difficult, and as people have said, this is going to be a very long process. But let's not say, oh, just because something's complicated, let's run away from it. We need to come together and listen to students, and we need to take action. Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Jabour.
Thank you very much. Gabe, thank you for coming. You've held classical and its general esteem. Very well done. And I'm going to ask you, because you're speaking on behalf of the students who would also be a stakeholder in this type of legislation. You know, we're hearing from the pros and the cons of gun owners in various groups, but the input of the student and the teacher is very important, and you've brought that to light here. I like your point about the fact that you feel that students probably do not want teachers to carry guns, which is comparable to what Senator Metz said. When we get to high school, I know growing up in a family of 7, having a strict mom, high school became my freedom area because now I was out of the house and playing an athlete and studying. But tell me, we've discussed enhanced school security. We've talked about even everything from lockdown to various types of bulletproof windows and guards. What are the students, what's the reaction by the students when you talk about that issue?
It's very complex because I'm a member of the Province Student Union.
Yep.
And we've actually had a lot of discussions about this, about whether certainly we all agree that we don't want teachers with guns. And when I say we all, of course, I'm not speaking for 100% of students, but I'm talking about the Providence Student Union and the vast majority of Providence Public High School students. Certainly, we know that we don't want, if anybody were to have a weapon, it would be, of course, we want it to be a school resource officer or a police officer. Of course, the goal is, because if you look at other countries, I mean, we're all the same species as everybody in other countries. It's not like it's anything different, and they do not need to have anything close to the amount of militarization that we have. And these, of course, are other complex issues, militarization of the police and everything else. That said, it's very complicated because we, of course, want security, but we want as few, if you are going to have police in school, security at school, it needs to be to the least extent possible in terms of not the amount of weapons that you have. Because the more you increase weapons, the more potential there are for accidents. Statistics back it up that the more guns you have, the looser gun laws you have, the more likely there is for something to occur. And a lot of students, particularly minority students, have voiced this, that they find big, tall guys with guns, they find it very intimidating. And unfortunately, I wish we could have some of them have spoken here tonight because they can speak to that much more than I can. But their relationship with the police is so much different, especially in Rhode Island. It's a very high proportion that are minority. And they really feel, they see the police in a completely different way than white people and white students do. And so I think we really do need to keep that in mind. And I think we need to attack the problem at the root, which is ultimately that we have too many guns. And yes, guns are getting in the wrong hands, but it's not a very difficult, as I said, causation to prove that more weapons results in more violence. And so it needs to be to the least extent possible. So does that answer your question?
Yeah, no, I think that's you've answered it, and I would hope that maybe Mr. Barr and yourself and some of the other group keep that conversation going, and with the school administrators and the superintendent, so that there may be some valuable input by the end of the session.
Yeah,
Thanks
yeah.
a lot.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments for Mr.? Oh, I'm sorry, Senator Metz.
Yes, yeah, I just want to compliment you. Of course, the two classical senators here are very proud of you. My daughter went to classical, and two of my in-laws, doctors in Atlanta, went to classical, so you represented the school well, as Senator Bois said. But I want to encourage you about the youth participation, because at the height of the civil rights movement, it was the youth doing the sit-ins when people wouldn't allow them to sit at the counters, and they had the Jim Crow laws and all of that. The youth played a significant role, even more so than their parents, because their parents had to be very careful of not losing their jobs or being lynched and all this kind of business. But it was the youth that stepped forward and really kind of propelled the civil rights movement. So certainly don't underestimate that, because it's the same principle but a different time, and I think the youth across America, and what you just expressed very, very articulately, I think that's going to really turn the tide. So keep up the good work, and if I live long enough, I know I'm going to read something about you positive in the future. So you keep up the good work. Very proud of you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Any other questions or comments for this witness? Thank you. Ma'am, good evening and welcome.
Good evening. Thank you, Chairperson Prada. My name is Gail Harvey. I'm here representing the Rhode Island chapter of the National Organization of Women. Before I get into my testimony, I just want to say I have been sitting next to this young man since 3 o'clock this afternoon. He is 18 and he is registered to vote. And much like the students in Florida, he will be voting and his friends will be voting. Just need to keep that in mind. I'm very honored to be next to him. I'd like to say I was here last week to hear the 3 students talk about the gun bills. I was not pleased as a citizen to see that 2 people from the legislature actually said in the newspaper that they were used as political props. Either those 2 people are very terrified of what people are trying to do about guns, or they're morons, I'm sorry, but that was a ridiculous thing to say. These are very brave students who stood up in the rotunda, as this student is sitting here today, to talk about guns, to talk about their lives, to talk about how they feel in schools, and we all need to listen. Thank you. You have 3 pieces of testimony from our organization. We are supporting S2289 Safe Schools, S2319 High Capacity Magazine Ban, and I'm here to testify on behalf of my organization and part as the Coalition Against Gun Violence for the assault ban rifle. In the testimony I submitted to you, it has been brought up by 2 other people about the damage that a bullet from an AR-15 will do to a body. So you will see in the testimony I have submitted the article from the Atlantic magazine from February 22nd. If this is a varmint bullet, then it must destroy woodchucks to smithereens, because what the radiologist said in this article of what she saw to the damage to a student's body, she akined it to a smashed pumpkin or overripe melon smashed by a sledgehammer. So these bullets from an AR-15 cause damage that is horrifying. So I hope you will have time to read the Atlantic article that I've attached. Once somebody is shot by an AR-15, if they survive, they're bound to have serious medical problems. They are bound to have post-traumatic stress syndrome, and their lives will never be the same. When people talk about mental health, illness, we need to lay everything at the foot of mental illness. Well, yeah, probably so. Somebody who picks up an AR-15 probably doesn't have all their marbles in place. But there was an interesting fact about Stephen Paddock, who killed 58 people in Las Vegas with an AR-15. They actually took his brain out and examined it. to see if they could find what was wrong with a person who would shoot 58 people at a hotel window, and they found no abnormalities in his brain. 22% of these mass shootings are caused by mental illness. So yes, mental illness is part of it, but AR-15s are part of it. I wish we could have everybody in yellow shirts and orange shirts and red shirts together when we're talking about budgets. Because the first things that get slashed in a budget are services, social services, services for children, food stamps, whatever. We don't have any problem with other areas, but when we're talking about social issues, that's where the budgets get cut. So maybe we could all get together and work on how we're going to do that. I don't want to take up any more of your time. You all have proved that democracy is at work in this chamber. Your patience, and you're allowing us all to speak what we need to speak or our feelings is greatly appreciated. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Any questions or comments for this witness? Thank you. Mr. West?
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Congratulations to you on chairing this prestigious committee, which is very important in this place.
Thank you.
I want to thank everybody on the committee for your time and your patience, your attention, your comments, and your questions. This is what democracy should be about, even where we disagree, that we can talk about things that really matter, but without getting bitter at one another, and this is good. Most of what you've been talking about since this afternoon has been about the soaring cost of gun massacres. You have recognized the fears that many, particularly children and teenagers, share. You heard a little earlier a pediatrician very thoughtfully talk about gun violence as a public health problem, and you heard a chemical engineer talk wisely, I thought, about layers of protection which are needed to prevent chemical spills and things like that. Somehow, you have to create layers of protection. I thought that Senator Miller said it very well when he said that there were no one bill that would solve this problem, but it would probably take many. I have a list of my responses to your bills, but they don't really matter. You will deal with the set. I want to say just a word about assault weapons.
Mr. West, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but is your button up? We can hear you, but the television won't pick up you.
Okay.
Thank you. Fine with me.
Sorry.
Everyone at home, I'm sure, was sitting on the edge of their seat, so I just wanted to make sure.
So what I want to do is say just a couple words about the assault weapons ban, and then I want to talk about the mental health problem, because that's a real one, and I've had some experience with it. I believe that these red flag bills that you will deal with are a very important part of the problem, and I was glad that you dealt last year with the domestic violence and the ability to take it away. I want to point out that the common element of what's going on in this crisis that we face in this country, what we've witnessed again and again, is the spread in this spreading stain of mass murder, is that we have seen often that these are committed by isolated, embittered men, mostly white men. And we need to understand what that's about. The common element has been that the shooter has been willing to give up his life, that he was ready to die. Maybe he wanted to die. He wanted to be killed and commit suicide. But he had studied, in many cases, they have studied the massacres that have gone on before and said to themselves, how can I outdo all those others who have gone before me? That's the phenomenon that you need to address. And that's going to be really tough. Now, I want to just say a few things about this extreme risk order. And I should have handed it to the clerk before I came over. I've got about 4 copies of my testimony, and I want to refer to one part of that bill specifically on page 2, where you have several categories in the section on petition for order. And so you're saying that a petition, or the sponsors are saying that a petition for a extreme risk protection order may be filed by a law enforcement agency, the Attorney General, a family or household member. I want to suggest that you add a fourth. And I would suggest that it be a person with direct knowledge of the risk posed by the respondent. I've put that in, I think, in my testimony. And I want to tell you just a brief story that connects that. What I'm thinking about here is teachers, coaches, social workers, therapists, clergy, who will recognize these risks. And if they have to file a petition and go to a judge, it's serious business. Now, I want to tell you a personal story. Before we moved to Rhode Island in 1988, I served for 12 years as a pastor of a church in Connecticut. And I dealt with numbers of situations where people were unable to get the kind of mental health help that they needed for members of their family. And I see people out on the side of the streets shaking down people for money, and some of them are high, and they've gone all through these things because they've fallen through the cracks of the system. They've not gotten the help that might have turned them around at a crucial point, and the further they go, the harder it gets to turn around. In any event, I saw a number of situations that might have been changed by something like the red flag order, or the legislation you have before you, and I want to tell you about just one case. There was a man in our community who used threats and physical violence to dominate his family and control them. The neighbors knew about what he was doing, and some of them spoke to me sometimes. One day, his wife and 3 children appeared at my office, and they were all visibly upset and terrified and describing his threats to them. She described an outburst in which he said he was ready to kill them and to kill himself. And that's the element that appears in so many of these stories. It's that the shooter has given up on himself, and it's usually himself, and almost everybody else. These people were not members of our congregation, but I reached out to a domestic violence program in a neighboring community, made arrangements to get the mother and the 3 children into a domestic violence shelter, and I drove them to a rendezvous where someone met me to take her and the children to this shelter. And so I didn't know where it was. When the husband found out that they were gone, he asked around among the neighbors and said, "Where did they go?" And somebody said, "Well, I must have told them to call Phil West," because that's what so he came at me with that, and he was demanding to know where they were and how they had gotten there. And he shouted that unless I told him where they were, he would burn down the church or burn down my house, and he would come after me with a gun. And I believe he was serious. He quoted things that he had done when he had been in Vietnam that were brutal and violent and criminal. And so he said, "I will do that to you with joy," because he didn't use the word joy. But he was talking about those atrocities. When he left, I called the police, and I said, "What can we do?" And they basically said, "Has he done anything yet?" And I said, "No." And they said, "Well, he'll probably cool off and he'll forget about it." Anybody want to finish the movie? I will tell you very briefly. In time, his wife and children came out, they went home, and the thing quieted down. He didn't try to burn anything down. He didn't shoot at me. But about 6 months or 8 months later, there was an incident where he barricaded himself in the house, shot out the windows, and held off the state police and the local police for a number of hours until he finally fell asleep. And then they came in and they took him, and he wound up going to prison briefly. We moved here to Rhode Island, and we found out after we came here that he had gotten out of prison and he had shot himself to death. I felt, if anything, relieved because he hadn't taken his family with him. But what a sad story that is, that there was no intervention except criminal intervention after he set off a fracas with the state police. That was the problem. So I urge you to go ahead and do this red flag bill. I urge you to recognize that it's not just the red flag, it's also the weapons, because they're so widely available and they can kill so many so quickly and with such ruthless efficiency before anyone can come. We have to cut down on the number of weapons that are in circulation, and we have to find ways to do it, and it's in your hands to do that. That's the challenge. So I think I've said enough. I hope that you will add that one change that I've suggested of other persons who may know directly of the risk, because I would have gone to a judge, and I know others in that community would have gone to a judge, but nothing could be done in that situation. You got to do better in Rhode Island. Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Jabor.
I just want to welcome Mr. West back. It's good to have you before the committee. I also like that you come in a re-election year because you say such nice things about the committee. I can quote you during the campaign. So keep coming, Mr. West.
Senator Metz.
Yeah, I just wanted to welcome Phil. I saw him at the senior agenda this morning. He told me he was coming. Good to see you. And Gabe, one thing I forgot to mention to you, some of my best assets getting leads with people that had ideas of violence came from the students who would pull my coat. And so working very closely. And I think if I can share with everybody, the surprising thing for me being the deacon is no one's talking about the spiritual aspect. But I want you to know there was a bunch of us when Senator Lynch Prada and Senator Archibald was here at 3 o'clock in the morning with the advocates for the Second Amendment trying to work out a common sense legislation that we passed last year, taking the guns away from the domestic violence. To me, that was prayer. People put all the emotions aside and said, look, we have to do something. And they got together and they came up with a bill, a compromise bill that both, a good compromise, no one's totally satisfied. But that's what happened. So for me, it's a very spiritual issue because, if my people, which are called by my name, will humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then I'll hear from heaven, I'll forgive their sin, and I'll heal their land. So this is just as much spiritual as anything as we deal with these issues. Because again, as I said earlier, we have to protect the kids and we have to protect people's rights. And we can get there, but we have to have the right spirit. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Senator Metz. Senator Archambault.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. West, it's always good to see you. I think it's worth noting in your story, as sad as it is, that at the time there was no remedy available to police officers, but Rhode Island is now the first in the country that has mental health police officer training that's passed and is now taught at the police academy by the state police and local police, and I think it's worth noting. So we're doing something right, and that's really the enabler for red flag once it's tweaked. Can't have red flag if you don't have that bill first. So I appreciate your testimony as always, and that's a sad situation, but you always have such good things
Senator,
to say.
if I may, one important thing about that is mental health is not just a matter of psychosis and diagnosable disease categories that would be listed in the manual and so on. It's often a situational thing where someone is already isolated and feeling a failure, feeling helpless. When James Baldwin used the phrase years ago, the most dangerous person in any society is a man who has nothing left to lose. And what we need to do is find ways of dealing with those persons who feel like they have nothing left to lose before they say, well, at least I can become famous. That's what we have to change.
Thank you, Mr. West. The next group of witnesses we have are Treasurer Magaziner, John Wesley, and Molly Thomas. Wherever you like, Treasurer. We'll begin with you. Good evening and welcome.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair, and members of the committee. Due to the late hour and the number of speakers yet to come, I'll be brief. But I was downstairs in my office doing, treasurer work and had this hearing on the TV and was inspired by Gabe and a number of the other young people who spoke tonight. And I was inspired to add my voice to the overwhelming majority of Rhode Islanders and Americans who support common sense gun safety legislation. Some of you may know I started out my career as a teacher. I was an elementary school teacher. I taught 3rd and 4th grade. And I will tell you, in the time that I spent in the classroom, not a day went by when the thought didn't pop into my head at least once, what if? What if today is the day? And I think a lot of educators would share that sentiment. And of course, there are things we can do. So one of the things that I've been working on over the last several months that you'll be looking at later this spring is the plan to repair and rebuild our school buildings. If the plan as it has been proposed moves forward, there will be funding included to upgrade the safety of public school buildings across the state. But that alone is not enough. And weapons of war, bump stocks, high-capacity magazines do not serve a useful purpose in our society. It is only a matter of time before the horrors of Parkland and Sandy Hook and Newtown and Las Vegas come to Rhode Island if we do not act. One of my duties as treasurer is to run a program called the Crime Victims Compensation Fund, where we work with victims of violent crimes and their family members, hundreds of people a year who have been affected by violent crimes, including gun violence. And we talk with the children, we talk with the spouses. It's heartbreaking. So I admire and I respect everybody who's turned out tonight. We all have other places we could be. And so people on both sides of the issue tonight, thank you for coming out. This is democracy in action. I thank you, the committee, for considering these bills, and I hope that you will join me in supporting them, and thank you for your time.
Thank you. Any questions or comments for Treasurer Magaziner? Thank you. Ma'am, good evening and welcome.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for hearing my testimony. My name is Molly Thomas, and I'm here in support of the Rhode Island Coalition Against Gun Violence and the Moms Demand Action for Gun Sense in America group. I'm testifying specifically in support of Bill number 2492, the red flag bill. And to begin, I just want to recognize the high school students and all their bravery in coming up and speaking. When I was in 3rd grade, and this is relevant, I was a student of Mrs. Rhonda Bebo, and in my memory, she was 7 feet tall, and her hair, it was the 80s, gave her another foot, and she used to wear red stilettos. And she used to say, "Life's not fair. Learn it early, and you won't be disappointed." And I say that to my children today, and it's kind of astonishing that they still say that's not fair, because I'm right on it. But life's not fair. Learn it early, and you won't be disappointed. But it doesn't mean you don't do something to change it. So keep showing up. I'm a Providence resident. I'm a mother of 2 school-age children and a 3rd that's soon to be school-age. I'm also a physician anesthesiologist at Rhode Island Hospital. I provide firsthand care for the victims of gun violence in our city. Most recently, I took care of 2 individuals who were on opposite sides of gang violence the same day in neighboring ORs. I'm not sure I can really say anything about what that meant to me, but I will never forget that that happened. As I recall, one was on his 2nd trip to the operating room of many, and the other one his 4th of many. And I raise this point to underscore the enormous cost to our healthcare system of providing operative care to these patients, because it's not like there's one big dramatic visit to the OR. These patients often have chronic pain. They have multiple operations in order to repair the damage that these weapons are doing. We, as anesthesiologists, take care of them in something that's very adrenaline-packed when they show up for their first visit. As they come back again and again, sometimes the same anesthesiologist will take care of them more than once, even more than twice. And it can be a struggle to make sense of it. These are preventable injuries, and this is a public health crisis that's been identified by multiple medical associations across the country. This is a public health crisis. And it has costs that are upwards of $5 million per fatal event. And I want to talk a little bit about mental illness because I think this has come up a lot tonight. And I am not a psychiatrist, but I have worked in a psychiatry ER. And I am quite familiar with the criteria that have to be met to keep somebody in an inpatient setting if they're not interested in psychiatric care. The mentally ill are more likely to be harmed by gun violence than to be the perpetrators of gun homicides. The American Psychiatric Association says that 1% of gun homicides are attributable to mental illness directly. If we talk about gun violence as a whole, suicide is the biggest concern for mental health care. And so, therefore, this idea that we should put resources toward improving mental health care is solid. But if we're going to do that in the absence of additional legislation to help get at the root causes of gun violence, then we are missing the point. I would say that this emphasis about blaming mental health for these school shootings and for mass gun homicides is a distortion and it's a distraction. So we can talk numbers until we're blue in the face, but I'm going to tell you a story. I've spoken about Dr. Michael Davidson in the past when I've been in
Doctor,
this
stop
room.
you for a minute. Senator Jabor has a question.
Doctor,
Absolutely.
thank you, but you just said something that struck me, and we're all searching for answers, and we're trying to rely on studies or data and statistics to back up. Do you have any significant data or studies that show to support what you just said?
That comes from a textbook.
What's being said is a distortion?
Well, if we're going to talk about mental illness as being a major underlying factor of gun homicides, that's a distortion. And I think it distracts us from getting at the root causes of gun violence and developing legislation that's appropriately going to target that.
Well, the chair of our Health and Human Services Committee is standing here, and if you've done your research, the Senate has done a lot in the state of Rhode Island. So many recommendations. So that there's a couple of aspects here. There's not just the issue of mental health and guns, but yes, the mental health issue and the kind of programs that we have here in Rhode Island that are getting better. So that should work very well with the issue of gun control. But to say that that's a distortion, I don't agree with that.
What I'm quoting is from a textbook about gun violence and mental health, and I'm quoting the American Psychiatric Association, and it's either 2016 or 2017.
Could you share that with the committee? Do you have something actually in writing that you would share with the committee?
I'd be happy to do that. I don't have it on me.
Okay, thank you.
I'll make a note. Okay. In 2014, I was a cardiothoracic anesthesia fellow at Brigham and Women's Hospital, and I worked with cardiac surgeon Michael Davidson. And I've spoken about him in this room before. He was a force, and he was a huge influence on my professional development. But he was also a husband and a father, a professional, and he was constantly pushing boundaries to improve patient care in cardiac surgery. On this particular day, we were doing a very challenging cardiac operation, and I remember that during the operation, the patient's aorta, the biggest caliber artery in the body, basically began to disintegrate under his hands. And so, he's actually on the other side of the drapes. I'm the anesthesiologist with his finger in the aorta, and he looks at me and he says, "So this isn't really going the way I expected." And then he said, "Buy me a couple minutes and I can fix this. I want you to drop the blood pressure within a safe range, but get it down lower, and I can do this. And he fixed that aorta. And I say that because he could have shouted, he could have blamed other people. This was really dangerous. This was like ready to blow. But he stayed cool and calm, and he did the job. And I was in awe. I was in awe of this man. And that moment of levity took all the pressure out of the room, and I was able to focus on my job better. And that was a thing about him, is that he brought out the best in other people. He was shot on January 20th, 2015 by the son of a patient who carried a concealed weapon into the hospital. The first thing he did was dive out of the room. He was in an office at the hospital. He had agreed to see this man, even though he had already discussed the care with him multiple times. He dove out of the room so that he could warn everybody else that there was danger. And my colleagues took him downstairs to the operating rooms, and they were unable to save him because of all the damage that was done. The man who killed Michael Davidson had a long history of anger. He had a long history of basically decades of being troubled, and this was documented. And that's why I illustrate this point for supporting the red flag bill, because he would have been a person who would have raised these red flags. This is exactly the scenario which I believe can be prevented by this bill. And I hope that you will support the bill and support the extreme risk protection orders.
Senator Metz.
Yes, I just want to make sure that I was listening to you carefully, and I appreciate your testimony, especially that very personal one. When you said that the mental health is a distortion that keeps us from dealing with the source, and then you went back to what happened to your colleague. What's the source? How do we get there? That's the piece that's missing. That's missing for me. So if we're making too much of it, only 1% has to do with mental health. If I was listening correctly, and if that's the case, what's the source? That's what I need to know.
My opinion is that some of the effective measures would be to ban assault weapons, to ban the high-capacity magazines, to keep schools safe from guns.
Senator Lombardi.
Sorry, Doctor, but from a red flag perspective, putting aside the issue of all the other bills, because I think, in my professional opinion, not that it matters, I think that the red flag bill may ultimately be the compromise bill, if you will, of the year, because I think a lot of people are in agreement on that there should be a red flag. What constitutes that red flag is a different issue, and the definition of what it is. And I think, and I'm not trying to put words in Senator Metz's mouth, but what are the red flags? If they're not mental health, what are the red flags that trigger the reporting requirement that will trigger a restraining order in the courts?
Okay, let me be clear. The man who shot Dr. Michael Davidson did not have a mental health diagnosis.
I got that message loud and clear.
There are people who might be brought in because they are feeling very angry. A person who is going to commit homicide may, and I can't say this absolutely, but may exhibit sullen behavior. They may exhibit oppositional behavior. They may make statements that express a lot of anger without an outright homicidal intention expressed. And so if you were to bring that person to psychiatric care, the psychiatrist would say, there's nothing that forces me, unless this person wants psychiatric care on a voluntary basis, that's fine, but there's nothing objective here that makes me say you have a diagnosis and you're in a crisis and you need to be brought inpatient.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments for this witness? Thank you. John, good evening and welcome.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and honorable members of the committee. My name is John Wesley, and I'm the Director of Policy and Advocacy at the Rhode Island Coalition Against Domestic Violence. And we are allies with the Rhode Island Coalition Against Gun Violence and Moms Demand as well. We're here tonight to voice our support for the bill that would prohibit firearms on school grounds, the bill that would prohibit high-capacity magazines, and the bill that would prohibit new assault weapons as well. Also, we're here to voice our support of the Extreme Risk Protection Order bill, the legislation which would disarm dangerous individuals who are at risk of harming themselves or others in the community, including family members, dating partners, or cohabitants. At the Coalition Against Domestic Violence, through our member agencies, we provide services for thousands of people in Rhode Island related to domestic violence. We know that women in abusive relationships, when they're in an abusive relationship, they're 5 times more likely to be murdered by their partners when that partner has access to a gun. And we know that the risk to other people that are close to the domestic violence survivor increases with access to a firearm. In our report on domestic violence homicides in Rhode Island from 2006 to 2015, we found that every bystander who was present at a domestic violence homicide incident who was killed was murdered with a gun. We also found that since 1980 in Rhode Island, every child who has been killed during a domestic violence homicide incident was killed with a gun. So this is not just theoretical. We're talking about a violent epidemic here. There was just a domestic violence homicide in Providence just this past Thursday, where a young woman in her 20s was murdered by her estranged boyfriend, and her 2 young children under 10 years old were both present in the house when this domestic violence murder took place. And this murder was done with a firearm. So we think that it's critical that that the legislature take action this year to protect the lives of victims of domestic violence, also to protect the lives of responding police officers and first responders who are trying to prevent violence in our communities. We hope that the Senate Judiciary Committee will support bills that keep dangerous weapons out of the hands of dangerous individuals who threaten others, and that we can reduce military-style weapons and high-capacity magazines that are capable of slaughtering children in our Rhode Island communities. I was asked this question down at the House Judiciary Committee as well, and we are, first of all, we're grateful that the Senate supported the Protect Rhode Island Families Act, which was passed last session, which disarms domestic abusers when there's a restraining order or a misdemeanor conviction. I think that the red flag bill, this extreme risk protection order bill, is critical because there are times when there's either a suicide risk or threats of violence from someone who's not necessarily in an intimate partner relationship, who can't get a restraining order that way. There are also situations where someone may fear that if they apply for an order, they'll be retaliated against or targeted by the person who has threatened them or who has access to dangerous firearms. And with the red flag bill, the police or the Attorney General's office could intervene on behalf of that victim so that they would not have to apply directly for the order. So again, we hope the committee will consider this life-saving legislation, and thank you very much.
Thank you. Any questions or comments for Mr. Wesley? Thank you. The next group of witnesses we have are Walt Robillard, Jameel Granville, Reverend Drummond. We'll have someone throw it away. Thank you. Sir, we'll start with you. Good evening and welcome. As long as the button is up, the microphone will pick you up.
Can you hear me now?
Not for us so much as for the television. We can usually hear for the most part, but it's for the TV.
Thank you. I have a little hearing deficiency too, so. My name is Art Drummond. I'm an associate pastor at a church in Uxbridge, Massachusetts. I thank you very much, Senator Metz, for bringing in the spiritual aspect of it. And I certainly am here representing that spiritual aspect myself. I've been in prayer. One of the things that's broken my heart, not just in the gun debate, but also in many other aspects of my country, is we're a divided nation. And I pray and hope for a way for us to be able to listen to one another. There was a time in my life when I would have been here wearing a red shirt. I grew up in the 60s, went to college in the 60s, so I was a peace, love, and flowers generation. And it was the world that I wanted it to be. I heard somebody talk about in a perfect world. And I really believed we could make a perfect world. I don't believe that we're capable of doing that as human beings. I think we can make it a better world. And one way is to really learn how to listen to one another. Somewhere along the line, I recognized things weren't going right. And I had some different attitudes. I've been a school teacher. I taught high school in North Providence for 29 years. And then I've been in ministry full-time for the last 20 years. I run a food pantry at our church. We minister to some of the most broken families, some of the most dysfunctional situations that in my generation growing up, it just wouldn't even have entered into my mind that things could be that bad. And as pastors and clergy, we're fighting it out on a systemic level. There's a breakdown in our culture. You can't fix that. Evil exists. When someone was talking about mental health, yep, there's mental health issues, and we have to deal with those. And you're going to have to wrestle with that. There's things you can't fix. I'm sorry, but it's true. And I know the issue here is guns. By the way, I'm going to try and be brief, but preachers aren't always known for that, so I will do everything I can to get to my points. I do have a few written down here. Say?
We appreciate that. Thank you.
I really want to hear what you have to say, Senator Archambault, but you're very soft-spoken for me, so. One of the things I believe that, well, if you'll just bear with me for a second, Jesus, when he was standing before Pilate, said that, for this reason I was born, for this reason I came into this world, to testify to the truth. All those who are on the side of truth hear my voice. And that indicated something to me, that there's not sides, different sides and shades of truth, but there is truth, and we're either with it or we're not. And forgive me, if I ever cross a line where I say something that is not truth, it's because of ignorance. And I've heard things said here tonight, I've heard things, and it tends to blow away the credibility of people who are talking. I heard Senator Lombardi say something earlier. I wrote it down. He said, bad facts equals bad decisions. And for those of you that are here in the red shirts, I really would love to. I hear your voice. I know the things that you fear. I know the concerns that you have, and they're concerns that we share. Being a teacher, being a dad, being a grandfather, safety of kids is so important to me. It's how are we going to get there? What are the things that we can do? Since we can't eliminate evil, that's the Lord's business. These are some of the things that really trouble me. And I'm sure it troubles anyone that are Second Amendment defenders like myself. When I hear somebody say that the only thing you can do with an AR-15 is hunt people. That's an insult to me personally. That's an accusation to me. When I hear somebody say the only reason somebody would want a high-capacity magazine is so that they can kill more people, those are the kind of things that shut down honest discussion and honest debate, because they're just not true. I got into shooting firearms about 7 years ago, and I did it because I was concerned about protecting my home. I'm now 71 years old. I don't run as fast as I used to. I don't think I could take a beating like I could when I was a kid, but I want to be able to protect my home and my family like any reasonable person would. It's just, what are you going to use to do it? And I would like the opportunity to make the choice of what I use to defend. And another term that I hear used so often is a weapon of war. Weapons of war are things like bazookas and tanks and napalm. When someone was saying, well, there's no difference between an M16 and an AR-15, except this one little thing. This little switch that you can make it go to burst fire and full automatic. Well, that little difference is a huge difference. That's what makes the difference between a civilian rifle and a weapon of war. An AR-15 is not a weapon of war. When I hear that, I'm hearing something that, to me, is a lie. I bristle at it. Please, let's start thinking about the words that we use. I'm going to try and be careful. I'm not going to try and assault the character of people who have a different opinion about me and my beliefs. I'm not going to try and point my finger at somebody and assign a motive to why it is they want what they want or they're saying what they're saying. I can't see what's in your heart, and you can't see what's in mine. The Lord can. So please, can we stop with the accusations? And I'm appealing to people on both sides. I'm appealing to my own friends in the shooting community. And darn it, after I started shooting, I found out it's a lot of fun. It's just plain a lot of fun. I like putting holes in paper. Magazine capacity, I like putting more holes in paper. It's that simple. Why do I need an AR-15? Well, why does someone need an SUV when they're just one person driving? Please don't be telling me as a free citizen what I need to enjoy my life or to protect my life. I don't want a bazooka. I don't want a Sherman tank. I want to talk about teachers. I want to address the issue of teachers. And again, the verbiage, even the people in the pro-Second Amendment community use a phrase, and they talk about arming teachers. I don't like that, because when I think of arming teachers, I'm thinking of teachers lining up on a Monday morning, walking into class and being handed an M16. That's arming the teachers. They don't want to do it. I wouldn't want to arm somebody that doesn't want to be armed. I don't think anybody would. But what would be the problem if a teacher is trained? Now, I have a concealed carry license in this state and in Massachusetts. I carry my gun in church. There have been shootings in churches. You're aware of that. There's a story that really affected me greatly when I first started investigating this. It took place in South Africa. We say, well, nothing happens like shooting outside of America. It was a South African church, and it was attacked by some terrorists. And I believe that they had AK-47s. And this man had been a former military man, but he was not allowed to carry a rifle anymore. But he had a .38 revolver, 5 shots he happened to be carrying. When they came in, they had some guys waiting outside for people to be running outside. They were going to, take care of them. He took out his revolver and got behind some pews while the shooting was going on, was able to fire several shots. I believe he didn't kill the man. I believe he wounded him, and he ran outside. This man went running outside afterwards and realized, I'm out of ammunition. I'm out of ammunition. Now, his shooting stopped the incident. They got in their van and drove off. Teachers are not idiots. They are competent people. And some of them may very well want to carry a firearm, concealed. Nobody knows where it is. Nobody else even has to know. But in an incident, and I don't care what type of firearm someone was coming in, I don't care if someone's coming in with a machete, a baseball bat, a pressure cooker bomb. We're talking about only guns are killing people. We know pressure cookers are. We know baseball bats are being used. Airplanes are being used. Automobiles are being used to run down people. But someone comes into a school with ill intent, or someone comes into a church with ill intent, and someone is armed, they at least have the chance to defend. One of my kids is a teacher, and they did a drill the day after the Florida shooting, and they did a lockdown drill. And she said, I felt so helpless because I didn't know what would happen if someone came through the door. Please don't take that right away. We may be one of the few states that's doing it. I believe that there are going to be more that are allowing teachers to carry a concealed firearm. If they are trained and it's their desire, please let them do it. I have a little concern about the red flag issue. In my experience as a pastor and as an experience as a teacher, I find that sometimes people lie. Sometimes students used to lie to me, stop them in the corridor, and they'd make up a good story. I have to say, here's my concern. And this is your concern. You're going to have to figure out how to, accommodate this. But both in the domestic violence bill and in the red flag bill that you're coming to, how are you going to prevent a situation where there's a neighbor that I don't like? Maybe his dog did doo-doo on my lawn or something like that. I've got a beef with him over something, and I know he has a firearm. I don't like the political sign he's got out in front of his house. And I'm phoning in, and I'm saying, this guy's a threat. What do we have to protect? We treat that person as guilty first, take his firearms away, and then he has to petition to get it back. Domestic violence, same thing. I have seen domestic violence, and it makes me bristle when I see what a man would do with his wife. But I've also seen instances where a wife will lie and say something that's not true. It happens. What is to protect that person from a false accusation? Like I said in the beginning, and I'm bringing it to a close here, it's a systemic problem. Talking about gun control. I pray for self-control. You can't make that happen. That's the job of the church and the clergy. That's what we try and bring to the table. Teachers can bring a lot to the table. You can bring a lot to the table. I want you to know this, though. You can't legislate evil away. You can't. And every attempt that we make just to limit things to firearms is really punishing more, and we've heard the word, law-abiding citizens. Don't take away our Second Amendment rights, please.
Thank you. Any questions or comments for this witness? Thank you. Sir, good evening and welcome.
Didn't realize it was on yet. Okay, so my name is Jamil Granville, and I'm 17. I'm a former student of classical. I mean, I'm coming up here to speak up about this issue, but unfortunately, I'm not, you know, a pretty little girl who can tug heartstrings. I'm the kind of guy that, I don't know, some people might consider me a little bit scary looking. I'd hope not, because I really mean anyone no harm. I have a pet bunny. What bad guy has a pet bunny? But here today, I've noticed there's been a lot of misinformation and, in my opinion, disinformation intentionally. Okay, so there is this misinformation somehow that AR-15 is some sort of a unique firearm, either whether it's in its function or its lethality. There are many other rifles that shoot the exact same caliber with the exact same barrel length, giving it the exact same function, regardless of whether it's a long or short stroke piston or various other internal mechanisms with the firearm. All that matters is the bullet, the barrel, and the muzzle it comes out of. I can name off of a few firearms. For example, the IWI X95 shoots the same bullet, same velocity, etc. There's also a very interesting case that I believe has been mentioned earlier. There is the Ruger Mini 14, which is a gun that comes in two variants. One has a wooden stock. Has wooden furniture, and it kind of looks like M1 Garand from World War II. You know, kind of an older gun. And then there's the Ruger Mini 14 Tactical, which has an adjustable stock and a pistol grip, and it's made with black polymer. And correct me if I'm wrong, but in the current Rhode Island version of the assault weapons ban, and in many other national bans, the wooden version of the Mini 14 is excluded, even though they are the exact same firearm, which just shows, in my opinion, a very large amount of ignorance how a lot of lawmakers don't know what they're legislating against. And Mr. Lombardi here made a very excellent point about how bad facts make bad legislation and bad choices. And I believe that before you guys even try to pass one of these weapons bans, I encourage you to do your research. I encourage you to do your research on firearms, how they work, the difference between different calibers and pistol calibers, and all these other things so that you can actually make an informed decision. Even though I personally do not believe that you should ban any of these weapons, if you're going to do it, I'd rather it be based on facts rather than misinformation that you maybe have acquired from the news or from family members or maybe just your social circle, because maybe you don't have people who are knowledgeable about firearms in your social circle, and that's fine. That's no problem. That's not your fault. You know, there's no reason to demand that everybody has an extensive knowledge about every single subject. But I feel it's your duty to do research beforehand so that you know what an assault weapon is, because it's a very loosely defined term. Tomorrow they could declare that my fist is an assault weapon because it has no real definition. They base it off of cosmetics. Most of these bans are based off of cosmetics, like pistol grips, adjustable stocks, which do not increase the lethality of a weapon. It's mostly for ergonomics. Ergonomics don't make anything more lethal. It just makes you a little bit less comfortable when you're shooting, usually for long periods of time, which these kinds of people wouldn't. This is usually something that people at the range would be doing when they're practice shooting or in competitions. It's ergonomics. Another issue I have is that when people are quoting these stats, they don't have the same margins. So a lot of these stats where it says, oh, the assault weapons ban decreased violence and decreased mass shootings is because they deviate from the standard of 4 deaths and go to 6 all of a sudden to make it seem as if there has been a decrease, whereas they're just manipulating the stats to make it seem as if there was some sort of decrease. And another thing is where people cite examples of countries that are vastly different from the United States on many fronts, based on their healthcare, mental health care, and the socioeconomic status of their citizens, which is one of the biggest causes of gun crime not related to mass shootings. People don't join gangs because they grow up wanting to. They're disenfranchised poor people that grow up in poor neighborhoods and go to poor schools, are poorly funded, would have bad books and not the greatest teachers, and aren't the safest environments or the healthiest environments to learn. If you don't tackle socioeconomic issues, you're not going to solve any violence problems. Because even if you ban guns, there's still an extensive black market for weapons. And even if somehow all of these guns were to disappear, you have knives, you have arsons, which can be committed with various things, whether it be gasoline or homemade napalm, which is easier to acquire than a gun. It could be bombings, where anybody can learn how to make a bomb, whether it be something simple or something complex, whether it be small scale or be absolutely devastating to the likes of which we've never seen before. You cannot solve the problems by removing the tools. There are tons of legally owning people who legally own firearms, law-abiding citizens, that would not dare point their rifle, point their pistol at someone and shoot them unless they feared for their lives, honestly feared for their lives. There's an old Latin maxim that says essentially that the abuse of a tool or anything is not an argument against its use. And I believe this rings true with here. Because all it's going to succeed at is disarming people who legally own firearms and abide the law. And I just don't agree with that. I feel like that's just not the problem. Another thing is, we already have plenty of laws, and systems like the NICS or NICS that prevent people from getting firearms. But in this case of the Parkland shooting, the police were called to this man's house, or boy, depending on if you considered him an adult or not at that point in time, 39 times over the course of 7 years, along with making multiple social media posts that many people at the school knew he was unhinged, and being reported to the FBI twice. So that's 41 times directly that the police dropped the ball. And it's also directly linked to the fact that that school department and that police department had an agreement where they wouldn't arrest students to keep the arrest records low so that they could get more grant money for their schools. You've seen the campus. It is an excellent school where this happened. Well-funded, countless buildings, nothing of which we have here in Rhode Island. Because I'm pretty sure, and I trust our police, that they honestly report arrests of students. Because that is their job, and I'm proud of them for doing their job. But down in Florida, they did not do their job. And if anyone has blood on their hands, it is the Sheriff Scott Israel, who was complicit with these actions that eventually led to this. The first line of defense and the second and third were all broken down by one man and his department's incompetence. You can't blame the tool that was used at the end. Would we blame the hardware store for selling somebody gasoline and acetone and other flammable liquids if they committed an arson? Would we ban the liquids? You can't ban gasoline or acetone because they have uses. But even then, those aren't constitutionally protected. It's a bill of rights, not a bill of needs. You don't have a need of freedom of speech. I could go on the internet and say whatever garbage I want. I could go out on the street and say whatever garbage I want, Not because I need to, but because I want to. And as long as it's not hurting anybody, I'm not breaking the law. And another thing that is just very concerning to me is that there's this idea with the whole weapons of war argument that keeps being presented, is that they, like he said very intelligently, is that it demonizes gun owners. I'm not a gun owner. okay? So, but even then, I can realize that it's immoral almost to try to demonize innocent people for a hobby. They have not contributed to anyone's death by any logical line of thinking. Only through an emotional line of thinking can you come to that kind of conclusion. And that's not how we should be basing legislation in a civilized society, as many people claim. There are many systemic issues here in America and other countries. And like I was saying earlier, people try to champion other countries as some sort of utopian example of crime reduction and gun violence reduction. But the thing is, why does it matter whether it's gun violent? Why does it matter if someone dies to a knife or a firearm? In my opinion, regardless of what someone died to, whether they died to a drunk driver, a distracted driver, a firearm, an arson, a bomb, poison, it's equally tragic. And we need to get rid of the underlying and deal with the underlying problems that cause people to commit these kinds of acts. And blaming the tool does not get us anywhere when people still harbor these kinds of toxic thoughts, ideologies, and a will to not just end others' lives, but their own, because they feel like that's the only course of action they can take, because they usually have just given up so much on life. I have seen many shootings quoted here, except for one of the deadliest in history of the United States, Virginia Tech, which was done with 2 pistols. Not pistols with some exorbitant caliber, like a .44 Magnum, but a .22 and a 9mm. I believe 9mm is the standard round that our police use in their pistols. And a .22 LR is an extremely weak round, but a bullet is a bullet. Anyone could die to a bullet. Just like a knife is a knife. I don't want to get stabbed by a Big Chef's knife or a Swiss Army knife. Both suck. Let's be real here. I mean, it's not accomplishing much. And as I was talking about with gun calibers and other things, I've seen a lot of misinformation being spread around, where one example was they compared the 5.56 round that the AR-15 shoots.
Madam Chair, if we can...
Senator Metz.
Yeah, you said a lot, and I was trying to listen. I stopped listening when you started talking about ignorance. So just so you know, there's been many gun bills that have come up here over the years, and we sit through this testimony year after year after year after year. So to say that the committee doesn't look at information, you made a big mistake there.
I'm not saying that.
Wait a minute. Let me finish. Because you're doing a good job. You're saying what you're saying, and you're expressing like you said. Now I'm going to express like I said. I'm from the hood. I've been to a lot of funerals. I know what it is to see people get shot and have to minister to families. So you don't know my circumstances. So for you to judge any one of us up here, I don't know you. So I'm trying not to judge you, but I stopped listening when you started talking about ignorance because it was wrong. There's your side, there's my side, and then there's the truth. And so what we try to do up here is we try to listen to both sides and to try to come up with what's best for our constituents. And the constituency that I represent, majority, minority, they're tired of the violence. They're not accusing anybody about losing faith. Well, I'm tired of going to funerals. I don't like seeing the young people when I go to wake and they're all outside crying. I don't like hearing the gunshots every summer when I put up the windows at my house. So there's a whole lot of things. So before you start stereotyping everybody, try to do like we do and look at both sides, and then in this country we can all make up our own minds. But I stopped listening when you started with the word ignorance.
Sir, if I may speak, I've seen...
I didn't ask for a question. I just made a comment, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Senator Metz. If you can continue on your testimony, but if you could start wrapping it up, we still have a very full room and people waiting outside.
Yeah, sorry about that.
That's
very
okay. We want to
long-winded.
give everyone the opportunity to say their piece.
But I just feel that we need to look at everything as precisely and as factually as possible. Not in a pro-gun angle, not in an anti-gun angle. That is basically the main idea that I'm trying to put out there. And we cannot always use these other countries as examples because, like I said, they have much different socioeconomic problems, borders, population sizes. Like Switzerland, for example. Switzerland has a very low violent crime rate and homicide rate, but their gun laws are less strict than states like Massachusetts, California, etc. Now you're probably thinking, well, why is that so? It's because the violence in those areas, in these communities, stems from socioeconomic issues. You know, that's the real core of the issue. If you help people in poverty, help people who are downtrodden, then that will probably cut a very large amount of the violence in general in this country. And I feel like that's the greatest priority above anything else.
Thank you. Any questions or comments for this witness? Thank you. Sir, good evening and welcome.
Thank you, ma'am. Madam Chairman, esteemed senators, thank you very much for your service to our state, and thank you for allowing us to come out here and talk tonight. My name is Walt Robillard. I'm a 20-year veteran of the United States Army and the Rhode Island National Guard. As part of that, I am also a proud Rhode Islander. I am here opposing S-2274, 2276, 2289, 2319, 2455, 2656, 2606, 2493. I'm in support of 2134, 2139, 2143, 2144, 2148. I apologize if I'm going quick. I'm going to try and cut this to 90 seconds so you guys can get something to eat. We have two problems in this state right now in regards to and in regards to firearms legislation. We need a balance of the rights of legal owners versus the ability of prohibited possessors to get their hands on firearms. The other problem is that we have an entire segment of the population that believe we should strip the rights from law-abiding citizens and faithful Rhode Islanders due to the actions of a criminal element. In the Army, we had a saying, you don't put a Band-Aid on a bullet hole. You find the problem, analyze and problem solve, and a fixed solution. Then you follow up on those solutions to gauge their efficacy. If they work, that's what we call policy. If they don't, you go back to the drawing board and start all over again. Many of the bills being considered that would curtail the rights to keep and carry a firearm show a willingness to do good, and we applaud this body for that. But some of these lack the forethought necessary to protect the right of lawful Rhode Islanders. In essence, the cycle of operation has been mishandled. Instead of ready, aim, fire, we have ready, fire, aim. One of the problems that some of this legislation would cause is that as a member of the National Guard, we are funded by the state. We only have limited funds to do certain training evolutions, and one of those evolutions is range time. Some units only get to go to the range one time per year. As a private citizen able to acquire certain firearms and use those at our discretion, legally, on a range, with trained personnel to supervise, we can conduct our own training. Make sure that when we have to go in harm's way at the behest of the Anchor Hope flag that you see behind you, we have the necessary tools and training to do so. There's been a lot of talk about why certain weapons should be in our community or shouldn't be in our community. I'm not going to speak to that, but I am going to point out that before the federal firearms ban in 1994, a court ruling followed by massive media attention drove an entire city to madness. In that moment, members of the Korean community banded together, pulled back to a secure location, and used semi-automatic weapons to defend their homes, their holdings, and their loved ones. That was during the LA riots after the Rodney King incident. It was Thomas Brackett Reed, who was the 32nd Speaker of the House, who said, one of the greatest delusions in the world is the hope that the evils of the world can be cured by legislation. We need to talk, we need to educate, we need to get with our young people because they are frightened, but they have solid ideas. We need to get with some of these ideas, weed through the chaff, and find what works with our state. And always remember that we all live here. We're all neighbors. And that's the most important thing that should come out of today. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much. Any questions or comments for this witness? Thank you. The next group of witnesses we have are Jennifer Bergevin, Cassandra Earl, Maureen Sullivan, Jeff Gale. Ma'am, we'll start with you on our right, your left. Good evening and welcome.
Good evening, Madam Chairwoman and the rest of the senators. Thank you again for giving us the opportunity to voice our concerns. My name is Jennifer Bergevine. I am a very proud Rhode Island public school educator. I've been teaching in the state of Rhode Island for 22 years and counting. I've taught in several different schools, in several different types of communities. I started my career in an urban setting. I'm currently in a suburban setting. I'm also a mom of a high school student and a first grader. I'm here to speak about the Safe School Act. I very firmly believe that there is no justifiable reason, in my opinion, for guns to be allowed on school property beyond those that are held by our police officers and peace officers. During my first year as a teacher, I was chaperoning a school dance. I was 24 years old. I had never actually been up close to a gun, let alone heard one fire. I'd never been inside a police department. At that dance, a fight broke out. Guns were drawn, shots were fired. It was the first time that a gun was discharged within a school building in the state of Rhode Island. It was 1996, I believe. Miraculously, no students were physically injured that night, and I stress physically. That evening, as I stood in the dark parking lot of the high school I was a teacher at, waiting for parents to come, waiting to find out if they had captured the shooter. There was a high-speed pursuit down 95. I had a young man come up to me, a very large, burly, football kind of guy, with tears streaming down his cheeks. And he came up to me and said, "Miss B, how could this happen in our school?" I had no answer for that child as I kind of looked up at him. On the following Monday, many students and many staff were very anxious walking back into our school. We were still questioning how a person with a gun was allowed to walk into our school, how that happened. And in the 20 years since that night, I have had many, teachers often call them day afters. The day after there's a tragedy, whether it's within our school community or on the outside, we come back the day after and our students look to us. They look to us to try and make sense of a world that doesn't always make sense. And it has not gotten any easier, and it just happens more frequently now. And never in any of these conversations has someone suggested that more guns are going to be the answer. When I asked my own son, who is a junior at the school I teach at, if he thought that it would be a good idea to continue to allow guns on school property by those licensed, and we talked about, what the parameters would be, he immediately and emphatically replied no. I asked him for his reason, and he simply answered, "It's school, Mom." I agree with him. A learning environment, I think Senator Miller said it earlier, that kids can't learn if they're afraid. A learning environment must be a safe place to allow students to take risks emotionally and intellectually, and guns are not going to aid that learning environment. Earlier today, I was speaking with a senior at my high school. This young man could be described as the face of our high school. Everybody knows him. Everybody loves him. He might have actually gotten the superlative of best all around or some such thing. And he shared with me that as much as he's loved being a high school student and as much as he loves our school, he can't wait to get out. And those were his exact words. Not graduate, not move on, get out. And initially, my first thought is most teenagers by the end of high school are kind of ready to move on, kind of stretch their wings. But he wasn't talking about that. He said he no longer felt that schools were safe, that on a regular daily basis, he walks into school questioning if today could be the day that something bad could happen. My school was Just yesterday, we were dealing with threats. We had extra police presence on our school property. It's imperative that we all work together to do what we can to keep our students safe. Passing the Safe Schools Act is just one piece of this, just one step in making certain that I know myself, I can look at my students in the face, I can look at my son and say that we've done our best, we've tried our best to keep them safe. I was pleased to hear earlier Treasurer Magaziner came in and talked about more money being available for school safety. The Sandy Hook Promise, there are programs out there. Unfortunately, we don't all know about them. But the bigger thing is making certain that we're evaluating our schools individually as districts, because they have different security needs. Those need to be looked at. And they need to be addressed, and plans need to be made in place. And the kids do need to be a part of that conversation. The last thing, and this wasn't in my original plan, but super quick, is just the cultural shift regarding social emotional health. There's been a lot of conversation. I've been here all afternoon and listening to a lot of very intelligent, very passionate people talk about the need for mental health. And it needs to go all the way down to our elementary schools, and this is bigger scope than what is facing you, the choices that you are making. But looking at social emotional health and wellness and making that part of how we're raising our children, so that they find better ways to express their anger and frustration than picking up a weapon, whether it's an AR-15 or a butter knife. But I thank you for the opportunity, and I really hope you'll consider all of the voices of the people who are in the schools. Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions or comments for this witness? Thank you. Ma'am, good evening and welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to speak tonight and share my story. My name is Cassandra Earle. I am a graduate of University of Rhode Island and having my master's through Salve Regina University. I have been a Rhode Island resident since 2006, permanent resident. I am here tonight as a private citizen to hopefully share my story in closing the gap that things can't happen here. I am also a native of Sandy Hook, Connecticut. I am a graduate of Sandy Hook Elementary School, Newtown Middle School, and Newtown High School. I want to also say that I am not against the Second Amendment. I have many immediate family and friends who are responsible gun owners. I am for sensible solutions that help prevent the epidemic of gun violence in this country. And again, I just want to help bring my perspective to some of the points that Senator Lombardi has mentioned and Mayor Alorza, that Rhode Island, that this hasn't happened in Rhode Island yet, and it can. Gun violence has many layers. In 5th grade, I was given the opportunity to speak at the commencement of our Sandy Hook graduating class, to which I said, I know I will always keep the memories of Sandy Hook School in a very special place in my heart. I wish I could say that is still the same, because now they are tainted with gun violence and the murders that took place on 12/14. Because the same windows and doorway that I entered for 6 years of my childhood, as did both of my sisters and my family, were shot through with a military-style weapon. The same military-style weapon that is designed to kill as many things in its path in as little as time as possible, and that successfully killed 26 teachers and students that day. The same classrooms I grew up in, that I had Girl Scout practice in, that I had violin practice in, that I went to school in, the exact same classrooms, because I know where it happened, is where children were murdered. And in the way, with a weapon that has been described tonight, that did things to their little bodies that no one can ever fathom. So I wish I could agree with my 10-year-old self and still have those memories in a special place, but instead they are replaced with mourning, grief, sadness, and anger. While I am fortunate enough to not have known directly any of those who were murdered, my immediate family and friends do. I can still hear the hyperventilating and crying gasp of my childhood best friend on 12/14, who I tried to calm down over the phone enough so that she could drive back to Sandy Hook to try and find her daughter, who was in kindergarten that day. Just a few months prior, we were talking about how special it was that her daughter was going to go to the same school that we grew up in. And now I'm on the phone with her, crying and pleading. Do you know if she's been found? Calm down, please. Do you know where she is? Does your mother have her yet? This is where we went to school. This is Sandy Hook. This can't happen here. My same friend, who in the weeks that followed, had to put her 5-year-old daughter back on the bus where friends were missing because they were dead. I still remember frantically calling my mother-in-law, who at the time was a teacher at Newtown High School, and for hours couldn't reach her. Or hearing the accounts of the unbelievable post-traumatic stress syndrome that the first responders were and still are ailed with from my younger sister, who was a nanny for one of the first responding policemen. Or the countless other connections and layers that occur from a small town community. Because Newtown, Sandy Hook, is a small town. Things like this didn't happen here. Nothing happened here. It was and is the quintessential, perfect, boring town where people go to feel safe and raise their children because it's a good school system. Just like the many communities here in Rhode Island that you think of when you hear good schools. Great place to raise a family. Places like Barrington, East Greenwich, North Kingstown, I can go on. That's Sandy Hook. Just last month, a former student entered Portsmouth High School. Athletic facility, physically assaulted the teacher, had all the students line up, but he had a knife. Had he had a gun, Rhode Island would have joined the list along with Sandy Hook, likely. But it didn't, because this isn't a knife issue. This is a gun violence issue. And there is nowhere that this can't happen. This is not normal. Children dying in schools at the hands of weapons like these is not normal. We cannot normalize this. It can be changed. And I just want to add one more thing. I am in support of the red flag bill. I do want to share that in the recent days, I've spoken with someone. I have a lot of connections to Sandy Hook and what happened there. One of which is a person who knew the shooter directly and spent time with him on a regular basis. I asked, would the red flag bill have saved this particular situation? They said no. Guns would have saved this particular situation. The banning of guns would have saved it. They had accounts of this person that showed no signs of violence. They were, to their opinion, socially isolated, but had no violent tendencies. So there wouldn't have been anything, in their opinion, that they could have brought up to authorities to have investigated anything in his possession. That's not to say that the red flag bill won't save many lives, which it will, but I just wanted to make that point that in particular to the person who I know who was directly in contact with the shooter from Sandy Hook on a regular basis felt that that could not have saved the 26 children and teachers who died that day. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you. Senator Lombardi.
I could certainly never imagine what your friends and yourself, by inference, have gone through. But I'm a good listener, and I need to clarify the record because I never said that I took issue that it could not happen here. Of course, it could happen anywhere. I took issue with the mayor's use of the word that it will happen here, almost in a promissory way, and I really strongly take issue with that. And I quantified it by my own children. In fact, my wife is a high school teacher in in Rhode Island, not in Cranston, but she's a high school teacher. So I take the issue very seriously. I would never say that it can't happen. I don't profess to know what the answer is to preventing it from happening, but I took issue with the way it was meant to say that it will happen, and I took strong issue with that.
Thank you, and thank you for clarifying that. I think, yes, I meant to agree. I was thanking you for recognizing that, because the point being that Sandy Hook is any town. So, yes.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments for this witness? Thank you. Sir, good evening and welcome.
Good evening. Thank you very much for being here. I appreciate your time. My name is Jeff Gale. I'm from Cranston. I'm actually a member of the Cranston School Committee, but I'm here tonight on my own time, and my words are my own. Just to clarify that. And people have talked tonight about how we have to look at mental health and mental illness and hardening the schools. And I agree with that. That is something we need to do. Cranston has actually taken many steps to make their schools more secure, and certainly mental health and mental illness does not get the attention that it's due. However, there are other answers. Other answers to the solution that were talked about, such as Senator Miller when he talked about that it takes more than just one bill to solve the problem. And I'm actually here tonight to testify strictly in support of 2289, the Safe Schools Act, because I believe that bill is part of the solution. It is clear that more guns equals gun violence. The research shows that states with more guns have more gun violence, and states with tougher gun laws actually have lower gun violence. As you probably know, gun violence is everything from homicide to